Host and guest and not WSTU. WSTU does not endorse any products mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WSTU.
The Treasure Coast longest running local talk radio show is on the air. The Treasure Coast Forum, brought to you by Get interested, get educated, get involved, and give us a call with your opinions at 220-9788. And here's your host of the Treasure Coast Forum.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Treasure Coast Forum. I'm your host, Reese Gabbett, and we are here with a few other high school students and a guest today, Mr. Tom Campenny, the former commissioner of the city of Stuart.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Okay. So glad to be here. Frank and I have been on the radio together a number of times, but I've never been here for this.
Wow. Yes. So it's very good. Thank you for joining us. I thought this was a good fit because of things that are coming up. We got an election coming up next week, and there's issues still. People will get in line at the voting booth, and then they'll start to get educated on the amendments.
Let me just remind everyone, they can take a cheat sheet in,
yes,
because the ballot is so long.
Yes, they recommend you do that.
Great that you take your ballot marked up so that you don't make a mistake. Because I've been a poll watcher this week, and many people have made mistakes, and they've requested a new ballot.
Yeah.
So I urge everyone in this election to bring a ballot with them that's marked up so that they go right through it.
Right. It's one full page, front and back. It's
very
full.
It is very full.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a few other high school students here. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
I'm Connor Fuchs from South Fork High School.
Sam Crombie, Martin County High School.
And Nicole Daly from South Fork High School.
All right. So South Fork is well represented in the room, but Martin County is they're there.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
See how it goes.
Yeah.
All right. So should we today we were thinking we were just going to go over the ballot, just discuss each of the amendments, the state ones, and then the individual Martin County ones.
Okay.
So we're starting off with number one, an increased homestead property tax exemption.
Right.
So,
well, let me ask you, how do you see what the homestead exemption is? How do you feel about it? And how do you think that impacts you and your government?
Well, I'm not really familiar with what the
it'll give people an extra 20, some, not all people, about 12% of the population of homeowners will receive an additional $25,000 exemption off their taxes. It does not affect school board taxes, however. And so 88% of the people will have no effect on. However, if you take away 12% of the money, or 12% of that tier of money, what happens to the county and if you live in the city, what happens to their taxes?
Well, so my question for you is that this 12%, is this more low income earners or high income earners?
It's anyone between the sweet spot of $100,000 to $125,000.
Okay.
I having been a commissioner, I know that in the city of Stuart, right now, 65% of the homeowners do not pay real estate taxes because of the exemptions. Look how difficult that is to run a city. And I believe in the county, it's something like 18% or 22% pay no real estate taxes because of the way our system is. I was last year, I was up in Tallahassee when I heard a state senator say, "What's the big deal? Just raise the millage rate." So they want, in one hand, say we've given you a tax decrease, and on the other hand, say, "Gee, you got to make it up, raise taxes." So it will have an effect, and it will probably. And what does it usually have an effect on? It won't be on education, but it will affect parks, rec, things like that. Because fire,
city services.
Well, general city services,
Right.
but fire and police, they're always the last to go. So we, as a group, we need to just determine whether we want to continue with an unfair tax system, which is what the real estate tax system has become in Florida.
Right. And also, I think it's something to consider that, like, when you allow individuals to keep more of their income, I think the question is, what are they going to do with it, right? Because, if they're just saving for college, if they're just, putting it away, that's not really helping the city of Stewart. And I don't think that's in that situation wouldn't be beneficial. But I think that, if you figure out that people are taking this money, right, they're spending it in their local communities, they're investing it into different local businesses and organizations, and it makes the city of Stewart and local communities more sustainable, right, more dynamic, then that could definitely be something to consider. Just as playing
That's the other end of that.
devil's advocate. Yeah.
Mhm.
Says here, cities, counties, and special districts across the state would lose an estimated $752.7 million in their budgets in the first year of something like this.
One more time,
a lot of
it
money.
has to be made up somehow. And so do we make it up by
Right.
taxing businesses? Do we make it up by by increasing the millage rate?
Well, likely like the cities and counties would increase their own taxes anyways, right? If something like this were to go through.
In all probability, they would have. I think Martin County is. I'm going to say $9 million. I could be wrong because I don't know Martin County as well as the city of Stewart. City of Stewart, I believe, was 280 or 300,000. So where does it go from here? I don't know, but I think people need to think about it before we. Tax cuts are great. I'm all for tax cuts. I hate paying taxes. I've been paying taxes all my life, but at some point, do we want to have any government at all, and how do we pay for it? Because we're not allowed in the county, the city, to have deficit financing. So we have to come up with the money. Otherwise, we have to cut services.
Yeah, so you have to have a zero balance.
At the end of the year, it has to be a zero-sum balance budget. So
We want to move on to
Next
That's
item.
interesting.
the next item. The next item is Amendment 2, a limitation on property tax assessments. You want me to read the little description here?
yeah,
Okay, so this is proposing an amendment to the state constitution to permanently retain provisions currently in effect, which limit property tax assessments and increases on specified non-homestead real property, except for school district taxes, to 10% each year. If approved, the amendment removes the scheduled repeal of such provisions in 2019 and shall take effect January 1st, 2019.
Once again, about 10 years ago, and you have to remember what was going on right before we had our great recession. Our property assessments were going up double digit, climbing through the roofs. And so when property assessments go up, what happens? Taxes go up. And so in that case, the legislature gave there was an amendment to have a 10% cap on any 1 year for business taxes, for business properties, and for our snowbirds. And okay, fine. Now again, this is coming off now. This constitutional amendment will keep it on permanently. One more time, we as voters have to decide whether the tax system we have, do we want to continue it this way, or do we want to make it want to start to go back to what ad valorem taxes are? Real estate taxes are known as ad valorem, and anyone here take Latin? Ad valorem is as to value in Latin. So originally, real estate taxes, you owned a house and they assessed it for $100,000. Well, you pay taxes on $100,000. They didn't care whether you were poor or rich, young or old, or how long you lived in the home. Well, we've gotten away from that with the first exemption. I think the first homestead exemption went back to 1935. And so the legislature, in their wisdom, have increased those exemptions. And if you stay in your house long enough, your value can't go up. And if you move, you can take it with you. So what we've created is not really a ad valorem or to value. It's really, if you stay in a house long enough, you pay very little taxes. There are people who pay, with identical homes, $3,000, and their next door neighbor, because of when they moved in, will pay $15,000. I don't know if that's fair or if that's the way we want to go. And because we have made a mess out of the ad valorem tax system, instead of trying to have it, I'm not for an income tax, but it's almost like an income tax with all the exclusions and so forth and so on. So that's something we should consider as citizens, and especially young people, because they're going to inherit this mess. And so at some point, they're going to say, gee, we'll never be able, even if we can afford a home, we won't be able to afford the real estate taxes because we're going to be paying here while people my age will be paying here.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So if this amendment doesn't pass, I have here that it could translate into higher costs for renters, financial burdens for those on fixed incomes, increased costs for consumers who shop at businesses, and more costs for those who own undeveloped lands. There's a lot of negative consequences to it not passing.
That's all true. But again, it's my contention. I don't want to pick losers and winners. And I would like to see us go back to a true ad valorem system, not make it more complicated. And so if we went back to a true ad valorem system, then the market would say, can't afford your house? Sell it. And those business taxes would then automatically be lower because it would be more broad-based. And we wouldn't have, in the city of Stewart, about 65, 66% of people not paying any tax.
Wow.
That's crazy.
And yet they vote and they want service.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not the greatest of systems that the legislature and the voters have given the state of Florida.
All right. Next item.
Next item. We have number 3, voter control of gambling in Florida. This amendment ensures that Florida voters shall have the exclusive right to decide whether to authorize casino gambling by requiring that in order for casino gambling to be authorized under Florida law, it must be approved by Florida voters pursuant to Article 11, Section 3 of the Florida Constitution. Affects Articles 10 and 11, defines casino gambling, and clarifies that this amendment does not conflict with federal law regarding state/tribal compacts. So pretty much it's just giving the right for voters to just figure out whether or not a new casino can open.
Well, how do you guys feel about that?
I mean, I think like just by reading it and by reading the last 2 amendments, I think that a lot of these amendments have to kind of like are stemming from this issue that the legislative branch isn't really doing its job.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, there's so much gridlock that we can't get things done, whether it be an amendment 1 and amendment 2 with tax reform.
They're punting.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so now it's like, well, you know, if the people we elect can't do it, let's just do it ourselves.
Right.
Because otherwise, nothing's ever going to get done. And when on the Florida Today article, they kind of break down each amendment, and they said one of the reasons people like this is because the legislative branch in Florida can't really get anything done because for 3-4 years they just argue back and forth on whether or not to do this or that with like casinos and with different tribes. So, I mean, I don't see any inherent harm with it. You know, if our policymakers can't do their job, then what's to say that we can't do their job for them?
Yeah, but then,
Anyway,
what do we need them for?
Well,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
let me ask you something else. Say Pensacola decides we want to have casino gambling.
Mhm.
They have to come to every voter in the state.
yeah, that is a problem.
Definitely makes it harder.
Does it
Yeah.
make it, instead of having the legislature say, okay, Pensacola, you want to have it, you want to have gambling, let's have a local referendum. And if you pass a local referendum, then the legislature will say, okay, we say it's okay for you to have gambling. Right now, if you look at who's backing this and who's against it, you'll see the tracks are against it probably, but the Seminole Nation, I believe,
Yeah.
is for it.
The Seminole Tribe and
And-
Disney.
And
yeah.
Disney. So,
Hmm.
this is a very tricky one, and I think we'll see as we go through these. If we have time to get through all 13, we're going to see a pattern, and you hit it right on the head. And the pattern is legislators don't want to do their jobs. They want to talk a lot, just like Congress. They keep
Right.
talking, but they don't want to do what they should do. So maybe the voters should start to hold them to what they are supposed to do and what they've sworn to do, which is
Right.
it's a representative democracy. It is not a democracy per se.
Yeah.
And so we can't do everything by ballot.
And maybe it takes something like this to, you know,
Yeah.
to show that like, you
they're
know,
not going to do their job.
yeah, if you're not going to do our job, we'll start making decisions. And if you think that the uneducated population making decisions on issues is a bad idea, then maybe you should start doing your job in a
Well, as long as
very
it gets,
negative world.
having been a politician, as long as it gets you elected, they don't care about that.
Exactly.
But I do think the younger people, and I'm all for younger people, and we just have 2 new commissioners at the city of Stewart who are 131 to 135. I think that's great. I think we should have more younger people running for office,
Yeah.
and I think because I don't think they're as jaded and they're more cooperative to work with everyone to get something done.
Right.
So
And on top of that, on like a federal scale, like I think that another really big problem is that, and like you kind of touched on it, is like, you have a lot of very ideological people running for office, like whether it be Andrew Gillum or Ocasio-Cortez. And like, I may not agree with their policy decisions, right? But like, these are the people that when they're in office, they aren't voting, to an establishment. They're not voting like with a party. They're voting based on these like more what we consider radical ideas. And you may not agree with it, but it's like that's the mindset of like, I'm not establishment. I'm not, I'm here to actually try to do something. So that is definitely like, I think something really important to consider too.
And I just read an article this week on Maxine Waters, and she will probably now be the head of a committee in Congress, but the Republicans on that committee all said we can work with Maxine. So there's ideological differences, but I do think that people can work together, and get things passed if people compromise. And I'm all for compromising in government.
All right. So next item on the hit
We
parade.
have number 4, the Voting Restoration Amendment. I think this one's pretty interesting. So this amendment restores the voting rights of Floridians with felony convictions after they completed all terms of their sentencing, including parole or probation. This amendment would not apply to those convicted of murder or sexual offenses, who would continue to be permanently barred from voting unless the governor and cabinet vote to restore their voting rights on a case-to-case basis.
All right.
How do you feel about
yeah.
that, guys?
Well, I actually just read that this one was certified by nearly 800,000 voters who signed a petition in order to get this one in there. And I think I definitely think it's a big part of the population that's not very represented.
It's 10%, I believe. Yeah, 1 in 40. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. But 10% is from the New York Times article I read. But
I don't know if it's 10%. It could be 1 in 10 African Americans. I don't even think it's that high. But I'm a very unusual person. I'm a member of the Republican Executive Committee, which I'm supposed to go to a board meeting when we leave here. But after that, I'm going to the NAACP when I'm also on the board. So I worked for the restoration, and I think it's a good thing. I think if you do your time, you should be able to come back into society. And I know people, I know a couple of people who 15 to 20 years ago came out of prison after mostly for drug offenses.
Yeah.
And even today they can't vote. They don't have their rights back. And is it fair? They hold jobs, they have children, they haven't committed a crime again. I don't know if I don't think we should take away their rights forever.
If anything, I believe that the point of prison is to rehabilitate, not to punish, but to
Right.
rehabilitate. So if the whole point of prison is to make these people better, then when they come out, they should be better people and should be. Well,
yeah, unfortunately, that's not how it is.
It's not
But it's
how
just
it
how
is, but
in
it's
an
most-
ideal world
it's-
how it should be.
That's how it should be.
Right.
So
Well, don't you think if you go into politics, we should strive for the ideal?
Right. Yes,
And so
I agree.
I mean, what are your stance on it, Nicole?
I agree that we should lift the ban on felons. Yeah. And I think it's kind of interesting that right now, like the governor can lift the ban himself. And you have to wonder, like, what kinds of people is he lifting the ban for? Most likely those that support his own party. So I think
apparently
they should be able to.
there was a Supreme Court decision that said the way Florida does it is illegal. So this will take care of it
Mhm.
Because it's so arbitrary and capricious. Who's the most conservative person here?
that's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
That's a really good
I don't know. I mean, I was going to say that like I'm probably the only person here who wouldn't agree with this amendment for the sole reason I think that like exactly what you guys were talking about. In the perfect world, jail is supposed to rehabilitate people. And I think that in a majority of cases, when you look at recidivism rates in Florida and in the United States, people aren't being rehabilitated. There aren't these rehabilitation programs. And so, yes, I think that there are great people who are rehabilitated, prove that they are of worth to society. You know, they go back into the system and they should absolutely have the right to vote. But I think that like when you have amendments like this that are like kind of speaking in absolutes where it's like blanket on everyone without having to prove that they have rehabilitated, that they've changed, I think that's really dangerous. So going back to the idea that people, can't make policy, I think that if you have an amendment that guarantees the right to vote for felons after they've proven that they've rehabilitated, maybe after not having a like recidivism in the last 5 to 10 years, something like that would be beneficial. But when you put this blanket on everyone, you're not. I personally feel that for the majority of people who are convicted felons, you're not providing a more educated voice for our vote, or a voice that I think that even should be allowed.
But
That's just my opinion.
even though in ideal world they would be better people coming out of it, and a lot of people aren't, they still serve their time. They still serve their sentence.
But again, I mean, if you're a first time offender for drugs, you're in jail for a month and then you're out, and then within 3 months you're back in for another 5 years, and then you're out, then third time you're in for another 10 years, and then you come out, you haven't shown that you've changed. And again, voting isn't a right, it's a privilege. We have standards set in society, so specific people can vote. But the idea is that you need to show that you're a contribution to society, because I think that we have the right as the population to determine what people, based on what they've done in regards to breaking the law, who can and can't vote. And again, I just think that there are great Floridians and Americans who are felons, right, and have rehabilitated, and I think that they should definitely have the right to vote. But for the majority, when you place kind of like a blanket on it, I just don't think that that's going to be beneficial to democracy.
So are you proposing like a test to see
Or-
if people are
or just more
being
specific
vaccinated?
Case
about
by
it.
case basis.
Case by
Yeah,
case.
it could be
But
case
that's-
by
Well,
that's
case.
how it is
that's what
now.
we have now,
Right.
and it's been decided by the Supreme Court that it is not constitutional because it's so arbitrary. I sort of I can see your point really, really well, but the minute you are convicted of another felony, you lose your rights again. It's not like they go with you. So if you're just like your freedom, if you once you've done your time, you come out and you're free. You're not on probation, because you wouldn't be on parole or probation. But if you're locked up again and you're convicted again, you lose your rights.
Right.
So it's not it's not
Yeah.
it's not
Well,
like
I
it's
mean,
automatic.
But once you come back out, right, that voting right is just restored again. I just, I mean, I want everyone to vote, right? I don't think there are great people. I know people who have felonies, not my friends, older people who have felonies who very much contribute to society. They pay their taxes, they do everything. I just, again, for a majority of Americans, and you could probably find the statistics, right? You have really high recidivism rates, right? And so when you have people who are selling drugs in neighborhoods, right, they're facilitating gang activity. They're holding back like entire communities. Whether or not you've been out of jail for 20 years on a felony charge, you're not. I just don't think you're contributing to society. So that's just my take on it.
Interesting.
I think we need to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, next item.
Perspective
Okay.
understanding.
Oh, wait a minute. You know what? Before we do that,
Opinion.
we'll just do our regulation timeout, and we'll be right back. So stick with us. We've got much more to cover. And now it's time for today's Southeast AgNet Report, brought to you by Everglades Farm Equipment, a family-owned business for the past 50 years with 10 Florida locations, including Fort Pierce, Okeechobee, and Loxahatchee. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right, we got a full house here. Bring us in.
All right, welcome everybody back to WSTU, the Treasure Coast Forum. I'm your host, Reese Gabbett, and we are still talking about the amendments on the ballot.
We're going to switch up the order
Yep,
now,
we
right?
just did number 4. Right now, we're going to go in reverse order just so, because we're running out of time. We're going to do the Martin County ones, and then we're going to go to the dog racing one, number 13. So we're going to start with the Martin County one that appoints the superintendent of schools. It says that it shall the superintendent of schools be appointed by the school board for the Martin County School District? Yes or no?
Well, come on, let
No,
me hear how you.
I
I
don't think so.
disagree. I
Yeah.
disagree. I think what's important it's ideally the school board would reflect, the popular views and know better than an average citizen what's important for the school district to have. But I think that it's really important that parents of students and people in our county have the right to decide who's representing us
Exactly.
in the highest
Yeah.
position.
So Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong. You clerk for the school district, right? Or
Yeah, I am the student news representative
okay.
for all the high schools. So I'm not really a clerk. I basically just present the news for each of the high schools to the school board formally.
Okay, so like in this position, how do you usually see how the school board reacts to different news events and information that you bring to them? I mean, do you think that they're effective in what they do? I mean, hopefully they're not listening. Be as critical as you want.
In my opinion, no.
Yeah.
There is one person, Tina McSorley, who I admire a lot. She's always the one that's standing up for, in my opinion, what's right for students. And then I also really like Marsha Powers. I mean, I respect all of the school board members.
Yeah.
I 100% respect them, but it doesn't seem like it doesn't often seem like they're standing up for what's best for the students. I know there was a lot of issues with the charter school being put through and different things. People seem to be pushing their own agenda and not taking into consideration what's most important for Martin County School District as a whole.
Just out of curiosity, what were one of the subjects that she was for that was important to you?
Well, there's a really big issue right now. We're severely underfunded, Martin County School District. That's part of the amendments we're going to be talking about. Martin County School District is severely underfunded, and one of the cuts this year was buses. There are literally kids walking across 6 lanes of traffic, middle school students walking across 6 lanes of traffic to school. Meanwhile, we're trying to pass this charter school, or we did end up passing the charter school being built, which is going to take money that would otherwise go to the Martin County School District and put it towards that. So Tina McSorley was very critical of the charter school and made sure that every detail of that contract aligned with what was best for Martin County students.
Let's get back to
Yeah.
this.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Interesting.
Let's move on.
Well, I don't think we
No.
want to move on.
Yeah.
Do we all agree that it's better to elect the superintendent?
Yeah.
And
I think so.
I mean, I think you're right. I think what you said was absolutely perfect. And I did vote, and I voted for an elected superintendent. And I've written extensively on it for my blog and other things I've written for the Taxpayers Association. But what is the advantage to having it appointed? I think we should really air both sides here.
I probably makes the process more effective.
Right.
You know, it's more of like who can these
More of a
school board
business
members
model, right?
more of a business model. I mean, it's
Yeah.
more about like cooperation, right? Because when you when you elect someone who may butt heads with people within the school board, that can be problematic. But again, I think that goes back to that's not really our job to make sure that there's someone in there that they all cooperate with. Like everyone should be able to cooperate, from the get-go. So, but
What's the job of the superintendent, and how does it differ from the board members?
From what I understand, I'm not 100% sure, to be honest with you, but I'm pretty sure they make executive decisions, right? And they kind of are responsible for organizing everything.
Budgets.
Well,
Budgets, yeah.
the board is a policy board.
Mhm.
All boards, whether it's the county commission, the city of Stewart, Village of Indiantown, or the school board, they're policy boards. They don't run things.
Mhm.
Superintendent runs the school district. So technically, the superintendent doesn't reports to the voters. Under this scenario, if we have an appointed superintendent, the superintendent then would report to the board. So I don't know if you have as much independence
Right.
of thought. And so to my mind, I would always go over with the people's making the decision over a 5-member board.
And the downside of that, Tom, is if you had a stinker for a superintendent, you have to wait for an entire election cycle.
Right.
Right.
That's absolutely
Right.
true.
To resolve that.
But-
whereas if it's board appointed, they can resolve it.
But that's called democracy.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
And
just
so-
saying, but that's
that's
the
absolutely
two different
true.
ways to look at it.
And I'm going to say, Frank, if we from most places, Florida does not have elected bosses.
Yeah.
And so in most places, we have strong mayors. That mayors actually run the city, and county administrators. There's a county executive that's elected and runs the place. We don't have that in Florida, so I think them taking that away from us would do the voters a disservice.
I
My
agree.
personal opinion.
I agree. I'm right there with you. Should we move on to the next topic?
Sure.
All right. So up next, Martin County School District half-cent per dollar sales survey levy for critical capital needs. So essentially, a half-cent per dollar schools sales surtax for critical capital needs is to be put in place on January 1st, 2019 to provide security upgrades and enhancements at all schools, replace Jensen Beach Elementary and Palm City Elementary, and repair or renovate district-owned school buildings.
This is so important. So recently, after the unfortunate tragedy in Parkland, the state has passed various legislation that requires additional security measures, which is I agree with, but the problem is
unfunded mandate.
yeah, we
Yeah.
can't pay for it.
Right.
The most recent school board meeting I attended, Sheriff Snyder was in there, I guess negotiating a contract. Basically, the school board is having trouble paying the sheriff for the school resource officers that are now needed.
Right.
Jensen Beach Elementary School is very, 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 like, I don't know the exact situation, but it's falling apart.
Yeah.
We
I've
have
heard.
a lot of issues that need to be taken care of. And in addition to the issues already pre-existing within our school district, now we have additional legislation, under unfunded legislation by the state that's being put forward. So I think it's very, very important that this goes through.
Right.
There is currently a $98 million backlog at the school district for capital repairs. Remember, the school board has two budgets, has an operating budget, it has a capital budget, and you can't borrow from one for the other.
Mhm.
The recent
No commingling.
no commingling. The recent $500,000 real estate tax increase is for your operating budget, for mostly for teachers, and they sort of spelled it out that way in their legislation. So that's a good thing.
Mhm.
In this case, that the half-cent sales tax, that is only for your capital budget. Now, I voted against it, and I'll tell you why. As I said before, there's $91 million, I believe, or $98 million in unfunded in repairs that they don't have funding for right now.
Mhm.
The state, about 10 years ago, reduced the millage that was allowed for this by a half mil. They just arbitrarily took it away, said, we're going to give the people a tax break. So they took it away from the schools, a half mil. Well, that would have come to $91 million. So there's really a great correlation between what they need to spend and what they would have spent if the legislature had left it alone at 2 mils instead of 1.5 mils. The reason I voted against it was I said, why don't you do a funding source, a bond the two new schools, which would be roughly $64 million, $32 million a school, and pay off the mortgage. We have one mortgage in the district, and that's for Anderson Middle, and pay off that mortgage. And the way you do it is to bond that half-cent, and then the taxpayer will know that it's dedicated is for that thing, and you get the money immediately with a bond, because as soon as you pass the half-cent sales tax, you can go out and borrow the money, and you pledge whatever comes in on the sales tax, and they know pretty much what's going to come in. It's $116 million.
I was going to ask that. 160 million? Okay.
116
116. Okay.
over the 7 years.
All right.
So I voted against it because they're not going to get the money for Jensen Beach High School or for what's the other one? I'm sorry.
Palm City.
Jensen-
Jensen Beach Elementary.
Yeah, for Jensen Beach Elementary, because they're going to have to wait to get the money in. So though they have said okay to the planning, and they're going to
Mhm.
spend the money on the planning, it's going to take them years to get enough money
Right.
to rebuild these schools. Under my scenario, they would have gotten the money immediately to rebuild these schools, and that money would have been pledged to doing the rebuilding of that school and paying off the mortgage. Because they also, and I don't remember the figure, but it's like $500,000 it's about $500,000 a year for the Anderson Middle School mortgage. So they would have had that thrown back in to their their capital budget for repairs.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
We'll be right back.
All right. So stick with us.
And we're back on WSTU 1450, the Treasure Coast Forum. I'm your co-host, Sam Crombie. And what are we talking about?
We are jumping right into number 13.
Amendment number 13,
The
okay.
constitutional revisions, ending dog racing. This bill states phasing out commercial dog racing, or not this bill, this amendment states phasing out commercial dog racing in connection with wagering by 2020. Other gaming activities are not affected. Yes or no?
How do you feel?
I
Nicole.
am all for ending greyhound racing. Yeah. Even if you don't care about the welfare of the dogs, a lot of people are for this because people who own casinos and different things are actually losing profit by having to do the greyhound racing in addition to their other business.
I mean, are they like bound to continue this race? Because like when I think of like, oh, like this industry is like dying out, kind of like you were talking about at the beginning of the show, and it's kind of being phased out. If that's true, why aren't these businesses like dropping it already? Why do we have to use this amendment to try to stop it? Like, wouldn't it just phase out if it is not becoming profitable? I'm just curious.
Well, I'm pretty sure legally they have to have some form of racing with their casino business. Like, unless
Okay.
you like, there are exemptions, of course, like for the Seminole Indians, but for anybody else who wants to open one, I'm pretty sure they have to have horse racing or greyhound
Okay.
racing affiliated
exactly-
with their casino.
That's exactly
Got
right.
you.
So we need to, I mean, I'm not a big fan of dog racing. I've never been to a dog track. I really don't know anything about it, except that I do know that they get killed a lot.
Mhm.
And then they're mistreated after a couple of years of racing.
Mhm.
But it's all tied in. The legislature, one more time, tied in regular gambling for pari-mutuel betting. And I understand, and I could be wrong. I was at a hearing up in Tallahassee a couple of years ago, and I think they said the pari-mutuel wagering in the state of Florida was only $9 million. So I mean, it's a nothing industry, but the gambling behind it is
Mhm.
immense. So I don't know. I voted no on this, not because I was against the dog racing, not because I was for the dog racing, but because I did not want to see these people go out of business for the betting, and that's what would have happened if they didn't have the tracks would have went out of business. They couldn't have their betting, their other games of chance.
But doesn't this not affect the pre-existing casinos that are already there? Like, wouldn't the casinos
Those
that are
particular ones I believe, would stay in effect, but there would be you couldn't expand your business. There would be no expansion of your business.
because the greyhound racing is no longer occurring?
Correct, because you couldn't open another track.
But from my understanding, the tracks, they were losing profit from the tracks.
Yeah, they were losing profit from the track, but they were making money on the gambling.
Okay, maybe I'm just misunderstanding, but I'm pretty sure can't the gambling still continue even with the track being gone?
Only I believe the amendment says only for those tracks that already have it. So if you wanted to open a new track, you couldn't have you wouldn't be able to
Okay.
have gambling anymore because you couldn't open a new track. So that gets back, I guess. I don't think we want to spend a lot of time on this, but this gets back to what we were discussing before about having a referendum every time you wanted to have
Right.
gambling.
And these are constitutional amendments, which is a lot different.
60% to pass.
Yeah.
So
60%.
I think let's bring it back to the legislature for them to do their job, and then I think we should do away with dog racing if the legislature did their job.
Isn't that interesting that a lot of these amendments aren't like in principle you support a lot of these in principle, but it's just the fact that this guy or this girl isn't doing their job, and so we're kind of forced to make a decision.
Sausage making.
Yeah.
All right, we want to jump to
Yes.
number 12.
Yes.
This is about the lobbying and abuse of office by public officers. It expands current restrictions on lobbying for compensation by former public officers, creates restrictions on lobbying for compensation by serving public officers and former justices and judges, provides exceptions, prohibits abuse of a public position by public officers and employees to obtain a personal benefit.
What do you think?
I mean, what do you think? You probably
Well-
have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah.
know.
Let's take a minute. Most local elected officials receive no compensation for being on the board. City of Stewart did, but most do not. They would be prohibited from lobbying, say, the legislature. And I'll give you another example. We have legislators who have consulting businesses.
Mhm.
They would not be able to come to the city of Stewart and say, "I want to represent. I want to represent ABC Corporation, who is before you to get a permit to build a building." So again, the legislators are supposed to be part-time jobs. So is it more important that we have laws against doing something illegal, which would be paying off, not being in sunshine, records violations? Do we need more? I don't know.
The Florida Chamber strongly opposes this amendment and thinks that it should be addressed through the legislative process.
Look at that. Wow.
One more time.
Broken record.
Look at that.
Where have we heard this before?
Yeah, that's a little funny, right?
Yeah.
But that's definitely interesting that, like, you know, in a sense, you're limiting, you know, politicians and, you know, government officials' ability to do what they do, right? What their
Right.
career is, right? And that's be
So
a
they won't
politician,
serve.
be advocates.
Right. They wouldn't serve on different boards.
Yeah.
As a public service.
And it's not just during it. It's what is it? 6 years
66
after.
years.
You know, it's interesting.
All right. Do we have time for one more?
We do.
All right, let's jump up to number 11. Property rights, removal of obsolete provision, criminal statutes. Under this amendment, it removes discriminatory language related to real property rights, removes obsolete language repealed by voters, deletes provision that amendment of a criminal statute will not affect prosecution or penalties for a crime committed before the amendment, and retains current provision allowing prosecution of a crime committed before the repeal of a criminal statute.
Okay, so this is like what we were talking about, like retroactively. So, like, if there's a mandatory minimum, the example Florida today gave is that if there's like a mandatory minimum of like 20 years, and then they repeal that and they say nope, it's a mandatory minimum of 5 years. Anyone affected by that will not be that won't like retroactively be affected.
That's correct.
Right.
It's probably a benign statute. I don't think bundling. We didn't have time to talk about bundling today.
Right.
But bundling all these amendments together, I think it just creates confusion on for the voter,
Yeah.
and I think it's wrong. I voted no just because of the bundling.
Yeah.
Right.
What was bundled in with this? Is
Well,
on top
you
of-
also have the part about not bright line,
The high speed rail, yeah.
high speed
Right, yeah.
rail, and that was on the I-4 corridor that was already killed, and so I just think we need to not confuse the issue.
Right.
Speaking of bundling, last one for today, number 9, prohibits offshore oil and gas drilling and prohibits vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces.
That's
Two
so
are very-
absurd.
Very related, you know.
Yeah.
Vaping
You want to
offshore
talk about
drilling.
bundling? There you go.
They said
Yeah.
it was environmental. I voted yes because I am not for offshore drilling,
Uh-huh.
and I am not for vaping. So I thought that was an easy one. It should
Interesting.
not have been in the Constitution, however.
Right.
Yeah, that's an
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
spot, right?
Right.
No vaping in public buildings. The
Right.
beautiful Florida Constitution outlines the big principles, mandatory minimums, rape and sexual assault, and vaping in public
Well,
buildings.
just real quick, you do know there is a constitutional amendment that says about pregnant pigs.
Yes. Yeah.
So
we talked about that in government class.
yeah,
and
so
how-
it just
yeah.
shows you how life works in the state of Florida.
Yep.
How are we doing, Frank, for time?
Well, we got just a little over a minute.
So why don't we have our forum just add up what they think about bundling?
I mean, bundles, they can be good like apples, bananas, but I think when it comes to amendments, it's a no-go.
I think it stops progress in a way because if you have somebody who strongly is for one but opposed to the other, you're not going to get them to vote either way.
Absolutely.
It's not fair, especially when they're so unrelated like that.
So let's keep the bundling to bananas, folks.
Thanks for having me, guys. I was a real
Thank you
pleasure.
for
very
being
much for having
here.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening. We'll look forward to being with you next week here on Treasure Coast Forum.